Let me start this review off by apologizing for not having this up sooner. I was kind of expecting to get an early review copy of this game since Namco Bandai had provided me review copies of the first two God Eater games for the Vita 3 years ago. But unfortunately, Namco Bandai told me they didn't have enough review copies to give one to me, and by that time I didn't have the money to buy it outright, so instead I went to Gamefly, which took a lot longer than I was expecting. But we're finally here, so let's get this started. Here is my review of God Eater 3 for the Nintendo Switch. The story of this game takes place about 9 or 10 years after the end of God Eater 2 Rage Burst. In Northern Europe, humanity is struggling to survive not only against the origami monsters, but also something known as the Ash. Strange environment and storm formations that are not only destroying everything in their path, but also creating new types of superpowered origami. To combat this, humanity is creating new types of enhanced superpowered God Eaters known as Ages. The unfortunate thing is they have a lot of power, but because they have a lot of power, humanity feels they're more origami than human and treat them as little more than slaves and prisoners, acting as if they're subhuman and don't worry if they get sacrificed. You play as one such Age who shares a prison cell with a lot of others and are forced to go out and fight origami. Thankfully, when you're out on a mission and an ash storm is threatening to envelop your base of operations, you're picked up and rescued by a traveling caravan and start working for them, not as a prisoner but a free member of their crew. Now the story has some flaws, but it also has some good points, which are in the form of their characters and the character interactions. The game's got a lot of themes around family and not leaving your loved ones behind, which work really well in a lot of tearjerker moments throughout the game. The only downer part of the story is all of the new lore and all of the questions that it leaves the player with. The Ash and Ashlands are completely new to God Eater 3, and outside of a few vague database entries, we're never really explained what it is, why it happens, and what connection it has with the origami. The game just kind of goes off with the Ashlands assuming you already know this and you already know the lore of the God Eater franchise. Now the database entries do help you with the basics of the origami, so you don't really need to play God Eater 1 and 2 before this game, but all of the new stuff is pretty confusing. When it comes to gameplay, God Eater 3 is a real-time action RPG, otherwise known as a hunting RPG. Across all the game's missions, you're going to be running around 3D areas with a party of characters fighting off huge boss monsters. When you start up the game, you create a custom character like you do in any hunting RPG, but I really like the character creator in this game. That's because of all the variety and the fact that your character finalization in the beginning of the game isn't all you can do to customize your character. In later patches that the Switch version is now caught up with, Namco Bandai added a lot more hairstyles and customization options to the game, and anytime you're at your home base, you can just go to a terminal and change your appearance from your hairstyle to your hair color. So unlike other games of this type, you don't have to completely start the game over and create a new character if you want to change what they look like. When it comes to game progression and the basics, God Eater 3 isn't that different from its predecessors. You're basically going between your hub of operations and missions, and when you're at your hub you can customize your characters, buy and craft new items and gear, as well as talk to NPCs to advance the story when it is needed. But getting out of the field is where the beauty and all of the fun of the game really starts to happen. Now it does have a pretty basic formula like its predecessors. You take a team of AI or human characters out with you and you fight monsters in real-time combat, with each mission basically having you go after a boss or multiple bosses when you get later on in the game. The combat itself is pretty similar, but there are also a lot of new features that were added that the previous games didn't have. Like always, all of your weapons can transform between melee and gun form, but some of the new weapons can transform even beyond that. For example, the dual wield weapons that you start the game with can transform between melee and gun form, but they can also switch between two different melee forms, the dual wielding blades and a double bladed weapon. And while more similarities than new features, you've also got the burst art system that replaces all of the blood systems from God Eater 2. Whenever you devour an enemy, you enter a temporary burst mode status where all of your stats are improved and you can replace your normal attacks with special burst art attacks. And on top of this are some new features in the form of support skills. Some of these are as simple as just equipping them to your character and using devour attacks so many times in battle, while others are team-based support skills where you link up with another character after you've fought so long and you each have different bonuses. These are all heavily customizable, where once you use them so long you'll unlock some new ones that you can use to customize your character even further. Outside of all these new features, the combat itself feels very fast-paced, even compared to previous God Eater games. The way the bosses move and the way the burst arts even move you around the field really encourages you to be much more aggressive than normal hunting games. I found myself constantly moving around missions and never stopping my constant onslaught of dashing and attacking unless I actually had to stop and use an item or got knocked out and had to wait for an ally to come and revive me. Just the way the game plays out with everything going on gives you an extremely fast-paced feeling, which is pretty different from the slow pacing of a lot of other hunting games like the Monster Hunter series. But with as great and fun as the gameplay is, there is one thing that brings it down, which is unfortunately something that has plagued almost all of the non-Monster Hunter hunting franchises: repeated boss encounters. God Eater 3 added a lot of new bosses to the franchise, but less than halfway through the game, I was already seeing reskins and repeated boss fights and story missions against bosses I'd already fought before. Now, on the bright side, God Eater 3 is better about this than the previous games because it has a lot less what you would call filler story missions. But that still doesn't change the fact that a lot of the quote-unquote new bosses in certain story missions were just old bosses reskinned with different elemental attacks. And when I got to one of the later story missions, I fought the same boss twice in the same mission. With all of the different enemies and bosses the franchise has at this point, they should have been able to make a new entry that doesn't have so much repetition with fighting the same bosses over and over again. But still, the gameplay is a lot of fun and it has a pretty decent amount of content and length to it. It's a little bit shorter than the previous games, but God Eater 3 took me around 25 to 26 hours to clear just sticking to the story mission. If you add in all of the post-game quests and all of the different optional stuff you can do, there's a lot of content to go around. Now let's talk presentation. Graphically, the game looks beautiful, especially in docked mode. All of the cinematic cutscenes that feature all the characters, including your custom character, look just as flawless as they did on the PS4. Now during gameplay, there are a few jagged edges here and there in docked mode, but it still looks pretty good, and in handheld mode it looks decent. There are a lot more jagged edges in handheld mode and there's a little bit of a blur, but it still looks quite nice. Now let's get into battery life, which I wasn't expecting much of considering how pretty this game looks. God Eater 3 has a battery range of 3 hours and 9 minutes on high settings, up to 4 hours and 5 minutes on low settings. Now in conclusion, God Eater 3's portable version has finally arrived and it plays just as well as the console version does. Now on the downside, the story does have a lot of holes and unanswered questions about the lore, and there are a bit too many repeat or reskinned boss encounters across even just the main story. But still, this is a hunting game that is extremely fast-paced and fun to play through. Reviews to Go rates God Eater 3 for the Nintendo Switch an 8.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.